So, it's the 60s, and major Hollywood studios are going insane in the membrane because foreign films are the new hot thing, and TV joined forces to ruin American cinema. This causes studios to stop enforcing the code as much as they did before, not for any social or progressive ideals, but for the profits. Because Catholic boycotts don't affect the industry as hard as they once did. The following films are going to highlight how the up-and-coming wave of directors were no longer paying attention to the code and how it affected relations between the film industry and their audiences, and how the views on sex and gender politics differ from their predecessors, or if they even differed at all.
1961, Splendor in the Grass breaks ground in being one of the first major motion pictures to ever touch upon the topic of teenage sex, female sexuality, and the vast differences in expectations between male and female high school students in terms of sexual relations. The film takes place in the late 20s, early 30s in Kansas and features Bud, played by the handsome Warren Beatty, in his first feature film, a very successful athlete with a bright future as long as he does not ruin his opportunities with sex, as explicitly stated by his father, played by Pat Hingle, who states,
"Old man understands, son. What you need for the time being, Bud, is a different kind of girl. When I was a boy, son, there's always two kinds of girls, and us boys, we'd never even mention them in the same breath, but every now and then one of us boys would sneak off with a girl, and we'd get a little steam out of her sister."
His father expects a bright future as long as Bud doesn't give in to his own sexual desires, which causes him even to get physically ill because the ever-growing pressure of not only his father's expectations, but his own refusal to succumb to his lust. This causes him to break up with his girlfriend, who we will touch upon later, because according to the patriarchal father figure,
"When I was a boy, son, there's always two kinds of girls."
On the other side of the spectrum, we have the dangers of the good girl, represented in Jeannie, portrayed by Natalie Wood, and how the pressures of the patriarchal society of what constitutes the proper young woman could do to the mind and self-esteem of a developing young lady. This includes the negation of sexual desires.
No nice girl does.
Doesn't she?
No. No nice girl.
And the emphasis of maintaining virginity intact.
Did he spoil me? No! No, Mom! I'm not spoiled! I'm not spoiled, Mom! I'm just as fresh and I'm virginal like the day I was born, Mom!
Stop it! Stop
I'm
it!
a lovely virginal creature. One thing to be spoiled,
darling. Stop it again,
Good
little girl.
down.
Down.
I've been a good little girl. I've always done everything Daddy and Mommy do.
But Jeannie tries to follow her mother's expectations, which leads to her not only losing her relationship to Bud, but her sanity as well, as she attempts to commit suicide and later gets institutionalized. In contrast with Jeannie's character, the movie presents us Jeannie, Bud's sister, who's a disappointment to her family because she lived an outlandish life as a flapper and doesn't seem to rectify her lifestyle. She lived in Chicago and was brought home after her parents annulled her marriage, which sparked rumors to circulate that the real reason she was brought back is because she had an abortion.
One of the interesting things about this film is that it seems to state that male sexuality needs to be sedated, yet female desires need to exist within established parameters. A woman cannot be too puritanical or too liberated. Jeannie gets punished because of her deviation from the status quo in the form of her father asking Bud to keep an eye on her in order to avoid anything that might embarrass him. And after being saved from a potential rape threat by her younger brother, Jeannie is not seen again until later in the film, where it reveals that she died in a car crash. Off screen. Jeannie gets punished by literally being institutionalized, but Bud doesn't seem to get punished because he is the one who decides to follow his father's advice and break up in order to have a short fling with a woman who was willing to satisfy his sexual desires. However, Bud claims that Jeannie is the woman he loves, But when she tells him she wants to have sex with him, Bud recoils and states,
Tiffany, you're a nice girl.
I'm not. I'm not a nice girl.
Come on, cut it out.
I just can't go on like this anymore.
Now, come on, Deanie. We're gonna go back inside.
No.
Come on.
No, I don't want to go back inside.
Deanie,
I want to stay here with
Danny,
you.
Danny.
I want you.
Danny, this isn't the way it should be.
Yeah, I want
This is a thread that we can follow all the way up to the pre-code films where men continue to police a woman's sexual needs and exclaim that they know what they actually mean and want.
Even though director and filmmaker Elia Kazan didn't follow the code rigidly, the film does not present explicit erotic scenes and still relies on the symbol and iconography meaning of nature, specifically the waterfall, which opens the movie when we first see Deanie and Bud kissing passionately, which ties back to our friend in From Here to Eternity, but also speaks about their desire for one another. Later in the film, the waterfall becomes a place of both excitement and despair, where Bud and Juanita are implied to have had sex in, and the place where Deanie decides to try to commit suicide. Water has always been a heavily erotic element and has always been interconnected with the act of sex itself, because after all, what is sex if not an exchange of fluids? But
Can it also have monetary value? Breakfast at Tiffany's, a 1961 film about two heavenly implied sex workers who fall in love in New York City while they try to get by, starring Audrey Hepburn as Holly Golightly and George Pepper as Paul Varjak. Based on Truman Capote's novel of the same name, that is where the similarities end, as the film glamorized a tale which contains darker themes in the source material. Capote himself even stated to his biographer,
The movie is a confection, a sugar and spice confection.
while we do agree with Capote's statement, we don't agree with his sentiment. For a mainstream Hollywood film, the characters seem to hold no judgment against sex workers. Instead, they find solace with the fact that they seem to be in the same line of work.
Breakfast at Tiffany's, out of all of the movies that we will be discussing during this transitional period, is the one that most feels like a classic Hollywood film from the Golden Age. With its beautiful aesthetic and star-studded cast, it is impressive how many hurdles it had to jump during production. According to Sam Wasson in his book, Fifth Avenue, 5 a.m., Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's, he states that screenwriter George Axelrod changed the grim end to a happier conclusion, but also he added irrelevant sex scenes with Paul in order to deviate attention to him instead of Holly to trick the censorship board, which worked at their favor. In her book, Breakfast at Tiffany's, the official 50th anniversary companion, Sarah Griswold writes about the marketing of the film, where the studio made sure Holly wasn't seen as a call girl. Instead, she was classified as a kook. Now, you may be wondering, what's a kook? Well, don't you worry. Producer Martin Juro has your back, stating, A kook is a kitten who'll never grow up to be a cat.
yikes. On screen, however, the erotic elements are few and far between, the most striking scene being Holly spying on Paul, where she finds out that he's a gigolo by witnessing an older woman leave a wad of cash in his nightstand, leaving him while he's sleeping. After she leaves, Holly and Paul have a conversation that sparks their connection. Later, the film focuses on developing their relationship without integrating sexual elements. It's not until at the end of the film, when Paul comes back to Holly having achieved financial success as a writer, that they finally kiss. Breakfast at Tiffany's stands on the sex is that yes, while it can be a line of work that gains monetary value, it's not completely satisfactory without love.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin our descent into Los Angeles. The sound you just heard is the...
Similarly, in 1967's The Graduate, starring Dustin Hoffman as a recently graduated student named Benjamin, who is seeking his place in the world. Returning home, he's seduced by the enigmatic Mrs. Robinson, played by Anne Bancroft, the launcher of 1,000 parodies.
Oh, hi. Sorry.
darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again.
There he is. He's in the pool.
You know what your problem is, Barry?
I gotta start thinking, B.
Mr. Finch, are you trying to seduce me?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
As the film progresses, Benjamin and Mrs. Robinson enter a rather passionless affair drier than sandpaper, where sex is much more of an act rather than an activity where two people actually enjoy each other's company. Desperate to get him out of the house, Benjamin's parents try to encourage him to date Elaine, Mrs. Robinson's daughter. Gasp. Benjamin finds himself falling in love with her, breaks up with Mrs. Robinson, who is none too happy about that, causing her to tell her husband and daughter that Benjamin raped her. After little to no convincing whatsoever, Elaine believes that Benjamin is innocent, but still decides to marry another man from college. Benjamin interrupts the wedding. Mrs. Robinson is pissed, and Benjamin and the runaway bride escape to the back of a bus and slowly come to the realization that they have made a terrible, terrible mistake.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again.
There's a lot we don't like about this movie, from the slow pacing to the lack of development of Elaine's character. But what we do find interesting about this one is the portrayal of not only the sexual relations, but Mrs. Robinson herself, the film's most aggressive character. An icon of sexual appeal, the name Miss Robinson has become synonymous to a sexually active older woman whose partners tend to be younger than her current age. While the fantasy of the more experienced woman is a common trope used frequently in contemporary outlets, mostly directed to the male fantasy, we do need to address the fact that Mrs. Robinson coerced Benjamin to have sex with her.
Oh my God.
Pardon?
Oh no, Mrs. Robinson, oh no.
What's wrong?
Mrs. Robinson, you didn't expect...
What?
you didn't really think I'd do something like that.
Like what?
What do you think?
Well, I don't know.
For God's sake, Mrs. Robinson. Here we are, you got me into your house, you give me a drink, you put on music, now you start opening up your personal life to me and tell me your husband won't be home for hours.
So?
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me.
And her behavior comes off as predatorial-like. Contrary to popular belief, which romanticized Mrs. Robinson's character as a cool and confident cougar, the film goes out of its way to show us a vulnerable and bitter woman stuck in a loveless marriage in the boring suburbs filled with rich houses and empty decorations. And yet, while these are elements that would make her sympathetic, we later witness the monster she can truly be when Benjamin does not want to see her anymore.
While Mrs. Robinson's presence is a very intense one, to further emphasize this, during the scene where Mrs. Robinson's seduction commences, we get a brief shot of her breast and her navel, placing us in Benjamin's shoes as her forwardness intimidates him. This technique of editing is used throughout the film to project an action or state of emotion without the character saying it. Another example of this is a montage of Benjamin's summer where he dives into the pool, and as the shot ends, he emerges between Mrs. Robinson's thighs. Hello, water. Here you are again.
Finally, let's talk about the murder of the Code Hayes. The culprit was the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, starring Faye Dunaway as Bonnie Parker and Warren Beatty as Clyde Barrow. Based on a true story, the film follows two young outlaws who fall in love with each other and commit crimes together, starting with petty theft until it escalates to bank robberies. Professor Mark Lapadula states that between The Graduate and Bonnie and Clyde, Jack Valenti, president of the MPAA, will be forced to get rid of the Code Hayes and create a new rating system, the one we presently use and known as the MPAA rating. This doesn't surprise us because it's the most violent film we have seen so far.
This film is considered to have created a shift in American cinema, and yet Bonnie and Clyde almost didn't exist. I don't think I've ever heard of that before. Oh wait! The hero of this tale of woe is our dear Warren Beatty. that decided to not only buy the script but also compile a list of directors who could possibly produce the film. His passion for the project drove him to fight for the movie's production with executive Warner Brothers Studios Jack Warner. Warner was resistant because he believed gangster movies were not profitable anymore. Well, history proved him wrong.
The role of director was bestowed to Arthur Penn, who had clashes with Beatty about creative changes to the script. The most important one, for the purposes of this investigation, is that in the original draft, Clyde Barrow was bisexual and will have a threesome with Bonnie and Moss, played by Michael G. Pollard. Penn decided to change it and instead give Clyde impotence because he thought the late 60s audience wasn't ready for this portrayal yet, and he wanted to maintain a sense of tension between the protagonists.
What other rules did this devilishly daring director break? Number 1. Nudity. When Bonnie first sees Clyde, she was undressing and she doesn't bother with covering herself up. Number 2. Phallic symbols. Clyde positions his pistol near his groin in a very subtle, very classy manner as Bonnie strokes it and looks at the gun seductively while Clyde talks about his career as a criminal, alluding that she was aroused by his stories. Number 3. Impotence. Clyde defies the standard Hollywood action hero by admitting to Bonnie that he is impotent. Number 4. The violence. Oh, so much violence.
We need to step back because the violence in this film is, in fact, a very big deal. Despite what popular public consciousness would make you believe, we always forget that the civil rights movement and social political movements that were taking place in the 1960s had violence in them. And this film is a direct mirror to that counterculture generation. Gone were the days of peaceful resistance and action was sought out. The outlaws were represented as the heroes of the story, robbing not out of greed, but as necessity. And we'll come back to that later. And the violence that takes place in their daily lives bleeds into all aspects of their personality and routine, including their sexual relations, a trope that we still see as heavily erotic till this day.
It's not until having a trajectory of violent acts behind them, like a psychotic Hansel and Gretel, that Clyde can finally perform and proclaim his carnal desires for Bonnie in a way she's probably never thought possible, in a field of flowers, surrounded by their own poetic and impending doom. Ultimately, the fact that Bonnie and Clyde were unmarried, unconventional, and nonconformists paid a tragic ending to their tale, where they are gunned down in a brutal manner at the side of the road, the flame put out as quickly as it ignited. Circling back to Splendor in the Grass, the film seems to state that people who live by their own code need to either A. conform, or B. die. Speaking of dying,
if you like our content, please make sure to like and subscribe in this video. If you're feeling good about all this sexy talk, please also comment down below.
If you want to keep up with our shenanigans, movies, and otherwise, please make sure to follow us in most, if not all, of our social media. The links will be down below in the description box.
If you want a quick solution for peace, block a centrist.